And good afternoon from Philadelphia. Frank here with yet another episode of UFO News Network Sunday, today on a very nice Saturday afternoon. And we've got a very special guest joining us for today. And to tell you all about it, my co-host, as always, the one and only Chant Hanna. Chant, how are you today?
Doing well, Frank. Thank you so much. This is going to be a really wonderful show. We have a legend and icon with us from the UFO community, Kathleen Marden, who is a sociologist, historian, and investigator of UFOs in contact with non-humans. She is an author of several professionally published books, featured on-camera commentator, and an international lecturer. She earned a BA degree in social work and was employed as an educator and education services coordinator while attending graduate school. Her interest in UFOs and contact began in 1961 when her aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, had a close encounter and subsequent abduction in New Hampshire's White Mountains. Since 1990, she has followed the evidence to uncover the truth about UFOs, their occupants, the humans they interact with, and the U.S. government's involvement in the UFO problem. She has worked on 3 social research projects with nearly 5,000 experiencers of ET contact. Her research at physical archives and her investigation of case after case of contact with non-humans has given her a depth of knowledge that few possess. I wanted to mention a little bit about Betty and Barney Hill. This is a case that I think anybody, it's sort of a staple of ufology. It's something that everybody who's not even in the community, the UFO community, would have heard about it. And that is, I'll read a little bit from Wikipedia on it. Barney and Betty Hill were an American couple who claimed they were abducted by ETs in a rural portion of the state of New Hampshire from September of 19th to September 20th, 1961. It was the first widely publicized report of an alien abduction in the U.S. The incident came to be called the Hill abduction and the Zeta Reticuli incident because the star map shown to Betty Hill could possibly be the Zeta Reticuli system, according to some researchers. Their story was adapted into the best-selling 1966 book, The Interrupted Journey, and the 1975 televised movie, The UFO Incident. It's September of 2016. Plans were announced to make a film based on the events with an unknown release date. Welcome, Kathleen, to the show. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm doing very well up here in New Hampshire for the week, and instead of at my home in Florida. So it's great to be with you.
Yes, we're very grateful to have you on with us. You're a wonderful person, and I would just like to say, and I can't say this, I can't emphasize this enough, you have to be one of the kindest, most good-hearted, heart of gold people I have ever met in my whole life. I can feel it from you. You're a really beautiful individual, and every single person I know has said nothing but really lovely things about you. I would also like to let our audience know that Kathleen has spent probably innumerable amount of time, thousands of hours, I'm sure, for free. She's probably out of pocket money-wise, if anything,
Yes.
regarding all of her contributions to the UFO/ET topic and other phenomena. And what she does is she spends voluminous amounts of time with people who badly need her help with regards to the topics I just mentioned. Now, one person who was very close to her was Stanton Friedman, who was a nuclear physicist and also a well-known ufologist who was also a legend regarding the UFO/ET topic, and he resided in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. We all miss him dearly. I wanted to ask you, Kathleen, when was the very first time you met Stanton? And in addition to that, aside from when you first met him, did you know when you met him you would become such close friends?
I met him for the first time, I believe it was in December of 1971. I graduated from the University of New Hampshire in 1971, and it was a year before we went to Cincinnati for graduate work. So I I believe that I attended Stanton's lecture. He was billing himself as the flying saucer physicist. I see in his records that he spoke at UNH in 1971. So I think that was the first time I met him, but I only began to follow his work probably in the 1980s. When I saw him on television, he had investigated the Roswell crash, and he was speaking at lectures. I began to attend conferences in the 1990s. And so that's when I became a big fan of Stanton. I liked him because he was a nuclear physicist. I knew he was being scientific. He was an upstanding man. He was meticulous in his research. So, and my Aunt Betty Hill had told me that he was probably the best in the field at that point. So I was very impressed with Stanton, and he was also very, very funny. He always injected humor into his lectures. So whenever I went to UFO conferences, I made sure that I went to Stanton's lectures. I never sat one out. He was full of information and very entertaining at the same time.
Stanton Friedman, whom we all missed badly. I know you do.
Yes.
We all, one thing my co-host Frank Stalter pointed out to me, which I was aware of, but I think Frank is even more acutely aware of this because he had the privilege of interviewing Stanton, was he told me, one thing about Stanton Friedman that was so great was he was available to anybody and everybody, always. He was never afraid of talking about anything that was UFO/ET or other phenomena related. He was a very unafraid individual with regards to debate. He had no problem debating anybody on any of those topics if he deemed it necessary. And he didn't shirk his duties as far as sharing any kind of knowledge that he might have accumulated over the years. He always shared everything he could with everyone. In fact, he has to be one of the easiest individuals to have had the opportunity to interview because he made sure that he was available to everyone. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. Stanton loved the public. And he said to me, you have to realize that you're not talking to college professors or scientists. You're talking with the general public. So talk to the general public. And that's what Stanton did. He was the public's ufologist and or the people's ufologist. And just about everybody loved him. The only people who didn't were the ones that he called the debunkers, and because he took them on and he defeated them. He loved to engage in debates publicly. He was very good at debating. He had been on the debating team for 3 years when he was in high school. And so that was something that he had expertise in and was at the top of his game in debating. So everybody did love him except for those debunkers, so he called them. I call them disinformants because they don't take the bunk out of anything. They tend to add bunk in order to dissuade the public from believing the truth.
Yeah, what a great way of putting it.
We had Stanton on at a very interesting time. It was not quite 3 years ago. And it was right after all this new information was starting to bubble out about UFOs and kind of a rekindling general interest in it. I can remember when I started following back in the 70s, there was a lot of interest, and then it kind of waxes and wanes over the years. But it was a very interesting time, and I just wanted to get your feedback on what's going on right now. new news seems to come out. We just have quite a bit of news coming out just yesterday, as a matter of fact. More interviews, more people coming forward, U.S. senators expressing interest in the subject, former director of national intelligence here in the States saying that we should be looking into this more and that there's something to it. Are you a little sorry that Stanton's missed all this? I mean, it's providing some real validation to his life's work.
Absolutely. If only he could be here to see all of this. I know he would be delighted, and I hope that he can somehow look down and tap in to this new information, this soft disclosure, this new interest. There was previously, many years ago, interest in Congress. Stanton spoke before Congress and presented a report to Congress. So he was involved in this, and then also in the United States, in the United Nations, when they were speaking about this and interested in this topic. But then, for some reason, the lid clamped down. There was a lot of frightening information about how much money it was going to cost. Dr. James E. McDonald was a leading scientist in that time frame and had made a proposal. And people like the arch skeptic Philip Klass, who was really a disinformant, and Dr. Donald Menzel were very concerned about this use of public funding. Also, Dr. Edward Condon, who did not want the scientists to look into this and used the cost of it in order to dissuade the Congress from passing the funding to investigate UFOs. But you know, it does not cost as much as Philip Klass said it would, and it is so important. You know, that the U.S. military has been studying this back to the mid-40s, and they did some very impressive studies in 1952 under the direction of Edward Ruppelt, who was the director of Project Blue Book at that time, the first director, in fact. There was a very important study done, a scientific study on more than 1,500 UFO reports that they had collected to that date. Many of those were by military personnel, and they did a chi-square analysis. They categorized them into different categories, conventional categories such as aircraft, balloons, birds, psychological phenomena, hoaxes, that sort of thing. In the end, 26.94% of those cases could not be identified as anything conventional. They did another one in 1955. It was done at the prestigious Battelle Memorial Institute, funded by the Air Force. 3,201 cases, and the same kind of thing. Put it into categories, do a chi-square analysis, what they discovered. In all of those cases, 21.5% were true unknowns. And in the chi-square analysis, they discovered that the longer the sighting, the more reliable the witness, the more likely it was to be unidentified and a true unknown.
Yeah, just really quick, in Stanton's book about the Majestic 12 documents, he had mentioned that it was the book by Edward Ruppelt, the Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, that got him into UFOs in the first place.
Yes,
I don't know if you're aware of that or not, but I thought that was pretty interesting.
Told me that story time and time again, and said it on radio shows that we did together. And He was working as a physicist at that time. It was 1958, and he was placing a book order, and he could get one more book and would get a discount. And so I think it was maybe free shipping. And so the book he selected was Edward Ruppelt's book, and he always said it was a good thing he purchased that and not the disinformation put out by Dr. Donald Menzel in 1953 after the Robertson panel recommended that scientists write books and articles sort of debunking UFOs, not using any evidence, but only using logical deduction. So Stanton was happy that he read Edward Ruppelt's book and not Menzel's.
Yeah, and it's readily available. If folks haven't taken a look at it, I read it very early on when I got serious about this. And it's a fantastic book. It's pretty amazing, a lot of what's in there. And basically,
Yes.
it covers, Ruppelt's time running Blue Book, which is basically the very late 40s into the early 50s. And it's free. You can find it online. It's available over at the NICAP.org website. And I'd suggest you go check it out. It's a very interesting and a very interesting counterpoint on what's going on today. Let's move on to you were talking about how obviously Betty and Barney Hill, you have the relation there, and you were aware of their incident, their abduction experience fairly early on. You're still in school at this point. Is that about right? If I'm understanding the timeline here.
I was 13 years old. It was September 20th, 1961. Betty and Barney had arrived home that morning. They had drawn sketches of the craft that they observed, found evidence that something had happened, and then went to bed. And they woke up later in the afternoon, because I had just returned home from school, when my mother was on the phone with Betty. And Betty was telling her that the craft had come so close that she and Barney were worried that they might have been contaminated. And so we had a neighbor who was a physicist, and she asked my mother to call the neighbor to see what he would suggest. They had already taken long showers, but they wanted to know if there was anything else that they should look for. Strangely enough, that physicist, instead of talking about a Geiger counter, said, go out to the car and see how the needle reacts on a compass. Now, you know that if you put it up by the battery, certainly the needle is going to react to the magnetic field. But she started on the side of the car, and she went to the back of the car, and there were shiny spots on the trunk of the car that hadn't been there the previous day. And when she placed the compass over those spots, the needle would whirl. But when she moved it away, the needle dropped down. So that was a mystery as well.
And there was sort of a process by which they came to understand that something very unusual happened to them. It didn't all come back to them right away. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because there was some regressive hypnosis involved, if I recall correctly, and so there was sort of a process in order for them to get the full understanding of what happened.
Yes, there absolutely was. Initially, Barney had full recall of observing the craft, as did Betty, at close range. Betty from 200 feet above their vehicle. Barney got out of the car, looked at it through binoculars, stepped back, and when he did, it shifted to an adjacent field and descended even lower to about 100 feet in the air and 50 feet from where Barney was standing. So he, in the original report, to NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. He and Betty wrote that he had observed figures dressed in black, shiny uniforms looking out at him as he was looking up through binoculars, and that they were looking for a qualified hypnotist because Barney had developed a mental block at that point. He had become terribly fearful, pulled the binoculars from his eyes, ran back to the car, screaming to Betty that they were going to be captured. They wrote about a series of code-like buzzing sounds that were striking the trunk of their vehicle. They also reported this. They didn't mention the figures on the craft to the Air Force the day after when they called the Air Force, but to make a Project Blue Book report. But that's only because Barney thought that he would be laughed at. They did give the information about the craft, that when it was so low, it was as large as a dinner plate at arm's length. They talked about the buzzing sounds on the trunk of the car, that sort of thing, to the Air Force. So and I think that that is important. But Barney wanted to forget about this. He said to Betty, "Don't tell anyone. No good can come of this. Let's just forget about it, Betty." Even though there was physical evidence on his shoes, they were so deeply scraped on the toes, he had to buy new shoes. But Betty would not forget about it. She went to the library and checked out the first book on UFOs that she had ever read, written by Donald Kehoe from NICAP. He was the director of NICAP. So that began Betty's prolonged interest in this case. And she became obsessed with finding out more. When they would come to visit my childhood home, which they did about once a week, sometimes more than once a week, instead of joining the family the way Barney always had, Betty would start to talk about this UFO sighting and the missing time, and Barney would walk the backlands of the family farm. And he didn't want to hear about it at all. Betty had a series of 5 dreams where I believe that she worked through any anxiety she had about what had occurred. Barney never had a dream about it. Barney developed bleeding ulcers. He wasn't able to sleep. He had what today we call post-traumatic stress disorder. He developed what they called conversion hysteria, where you develop physiological symptoms that are psychogenically induced. And with the bleeding ulcer, he ended up in the hospital. He had high blood pressure. He had to take a 3-month leave of absence from work. And this finally led to a referral to Dr. Benjamin Simon, because Dr. Simon had earned a reputation for himself through developing a new type of hypnosis that would get to the problem. He, during World War II, had set up the psychiatric unit at the Mason General Hospital on Long Island, New York. He was a colonel in the Army and a neuropsychiatrist. He had a tremendous amount of success in working with these veterans who were returning from the war, who had injuries. And let me use an example. A man was blinded, but there was no physical condition. His eyes were not damaged. And the other psychiatrists did not have luck with him in overcoming this problem, because they only went as far as him seeing his friend killed in front of him. But Dr. Simon had this technique of probing deeply, and he went back into the man's history. A couple of weeks before this happened, he had received a Dear John letter from his sweetheart calling off the relationship. And it was the combination of these things that caused the blindness. Dr. Simon worked through all of that with him in deep trance hypnosis and then commanded him to see again, and he regained his eyesight. In fact, Dr. Simon had a movie made about his work. It was called Let There Be Light, a John Huston movie. And he also taught at Harvard, he taught at Yale. He owned his own private psychiatric hospital at one point. But when Betty and Barney saw him, and Barney was the person who was actually referred to him for treatment, he was aging, and it was not too long before he was ready to retire. So he had a very long and successful history of treating people who had conversion hysteria, such as Barney.
Now, during this time frame, has this news gotten out? I mean, is this public, or the Hills getting any kind of feedback or harassment or anything like that, or is this still pretty much within the family and within the report to the Air Force and the medical professionals?
Betty and Barney were willing to talk to military officers, to UFO investigators, to scientists. They told the family, but we were sworn to secrecy. They told close friends, and they were sworn to secrecy. They never wanted this information to be released to the public. Betty was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. Barney worked for the U.S. Post Office, but they were both very heavily involved in politics in the state of New Hampshire and in the civil rights movement. In fact, the information wasn't released to the public until the fall of 1965, and that was the result of a violation of confidentiality. That year, Barney and Betty had been invited guests to Lyndon Johnson's inauguration. I was as well and went with them. Barney had been appointed to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights State Advisory Committee for the state of New Hampshire by the governor. He had also received an award from Sergeant Shriver, the head of the U.S. government's poverty program, because Barney and Betty had worked together to set up the Rockingham County Community Action Program, and using funding from the Office of Economic Opportunity. And he also received an award from the Archdiocese for the state of New Hampshire for setting up a literacy program for the people of New Hampshire through the Archdiocese. So they were very politically involved. They were good members of society, just doing everything right. They never wanted this kooky story to come out. But unfortunately, in September of 1965, a friend of Betty's violated confidentiality when she talked with a friend of hers who was a newspaper reporter for the Boston Traveler. And she gave him a great deal of information. He contacted Betty and Barney, and he named her and said that she had told him a great many things about what happened to them, and he believed that it was probably the most important case in history. He wanted to talk with them, and they refused. They would not speak about it. They said, "We don't want anyone to write about it. We could lose our jobs." And they thought that they were safe at that point. But at the end of October, for 5 consecutive days, their story ran in the Boston Traveler. And John Luttrell, who was the reporter, interviewed people in upstate New Hampshire who were witnesses. He interviewed members of the Air Force, and he interviewed many other people as well who didn't realize that Betty and Barney wanted this to remain confidential.
And what happened from there? I mean, at some point in time, well, at least Betty did, obviously, if not embraced, at least accepted the fact that the story was out. So, we may as well be a little bit more open about it. And how did that process work out?
Well, we met as a family. There were reporters all around the house anyway, so Betty and Barney escaped and drove the 20 miles to Kingston, New Hampshire, where I grew up. I lived across the street from my grandparents, Betty's parents, and we all sat down, my parents and other family members, and talked about what to do next, because this not only impacted Betty and Barney, it had an impact on the entire family. And what we decided was that since this story had already been released, the public knew about it, that they might as well talk about it. I think that Barney was more reluctant than Betty. He was so committed to his work in civil rights. He didn't really want anything to interfere with that, but he did agree to talk about his sighting. And he did that in early November of 1965 at the Unitarian Church in Dover, New Hampshire. And he was introduced to this huge crowd. The church was overflowing with people. And he was introduced by the public information officer from Pease Air Force Base, who said that many people had been reporting UFOs and that Betty and Barney had had a sighting that they were going to talk about. They did not discuss the abduction or anything that came out under hypnosis. They didn't consciously remember the abduction. They had only consciously recalled observing a fiery orb that seemed to be sitting on the road, finding themselves on a dirt road with tall trees all around, and encountering a roadblock somewhere along the way. They had vague memories about that. So they did talk only about the close encounter, the craft that came down. I wasn't there, so I don't know everything they said, but they did speak about the sighting itself. And at that point, John Fuller, who was in the area to write the book, The Incident at Exeter, about another close encounter between police officers and a young man who was 18 years old and just preparing to go into the service. He was writing that book. He approached Betty and Barney and said, "I'd like to write your story." And he had a proposal for them. They rejected the proposal initially, and they talked. They were willing to talk with him. And they would only write the book if Dr. Benjamin Simon was involved in it as well, and if it focused on the hypnosis itself. So finally, they all reached an agreement, and John focused on the hypnosis.
And just to bring us up to as far as we can on the story. It obviously Betty lived a long time after Barney had tragically passed away. Not too long after, is that correct? Just a decade or so after.
Barney passed away in February of 1969.
Okay, so yeah, it was less than a decade.
The book was released. It was released in the book was released in the fall of 1966, and he was dead a little more than 2 years later.
And Betty continued on. She was a little bit more open as time went on, as far as sharing information about the experience.
Yes, she was far more open as time went on. When Barney was still alive, there was a team of scientists who had asked Betty and Barney to take part in contact experiments. These scientists gave them the text that they were to try to communicate to these ETs. Betty was the one who attempted to do the communicating. She would go out onto her porch at night and send these telepathic messages into the air, hoping that they would be picked up. And then the scientists would go to a certain area where they wanted the UFO to show itself and look for the craft. One of those places was my grandparents' farm. Now, Betty and Barney were looking there. The scientists lived in other areas of the country, one in New York and one down south. I think it was in Georgia. So Betty and Barney did look. There was a craft that did come in at one time and left physical trace marks on the ground at my grandparents' farm. It came in about 200 feet from my childhood home, and it was observed by two individuals who saw it. One was my grandmother. The other was a man who lived up the street who was returning home from work, and it was scientifically investigated. There were a lot of sightings in that part of New Hampshire when Betty was trying to call these crafts in. And sometimes the scientists would see the craft too, but not always. So they couldn't state that they were convinced that it was Betty who was calling in the craft. It might have just been coming in on its own without her experiment, but that was sort of the conclusion they reached. But Betty continued these experiments and ended up talking about it publicly. And that is when she was so heavily criticized.
And also there was a map, basically, that Betty was able to put together based on something that she had seen while in the company of the ETs, and that relates to the Zeta Reticuli system. There was some work done by a lady named Marjorie Fish. This is I think this is a fascinating piece, and can you talk about that a little bit?
I would love to, because this is where Stanton came in on that case. Let me start from the beginning. What happened is that when Dr. Simon was hypnotizing Betty, she said that her examination had been finished. The examiner went in to examine Barney, or at least he'd left the room. She didn't know where he went, really. And so she said to the one that she called the leader, "I know you're not from around here. Where's your home port?" And he produced this three-dimensional star map, and on it were two stars in the foreground that were about the size of nickels or quarters. They were connected by 5 solid lines. And then there were other stars that were just tiny circles that were connected by 2 or 3 solid lines. And then on the map, there were some stars that were connected by dotted lines, others that were not connected by lines at all. And so Betty said to him, "Well, where are you on this map?" And she was made to understand that the solid lines represented trade routes, and the dotted lines represented expeditions. So she said, "Where are you from on this map? Where are you?" And he said, "Well, where are you on this map?" And she said, "I don't know. I know very little about the universe." And he said, "Well, if you don't know where you are, how can I tell you where I am?" So then he just made it go away, put it back into the wall, or whatever happened. And Dr. Simon told Betty to, under hypnotic suggestion, to draw that when she arrived home, and over the next couple of weeks, as long as she could remember it accurately, and it didn't trouble her too much. So she did actually draw it. Her conscious recall took over a little bit, or her rational mind, and she erased a line and drew it differently. But Marjorie Fish saw it in the first book that was ever published about their case, The Interrupted Journey by John G. Fuller. And Marjorie was a brilliant woman from Ohio. She had studied biology in college. She, at that time, was a school teacher. She was single, and she was skeptical, but she thought that perhaps she would be able to find where these non-human entities came from. And so she set out by going to the university, and there were no copy machines back in those days. She had to sit in the astronomy department library and copy all of the characteristics of the stars and the distance data that they had at that time. And she did this for all parts, the complete circle around our sun, out 54 light years. And she started building three-dimensional models using a frame and monofilament line and beads of various sizes and colors to represent the types of stars that they were. And imagine the work she had to do to take this information back and to do the math to calculate where each of these stars was supposed to be in its three-dimensional frame. And years went by, and she still did not have a match by 1972. But she persevered. She had interviewed Betty. She had been to New Hampshire, and finally, a new Gliese catalog was released in 1972 with new distance data and stars that were identified within 54 light years that hadn't been in the previous catalogs. So she took this new information home, and she had another star map, another construction, and using the new distance data. Using that new data, she found a match. So this was extraordinary. Finally, after all these years of work, she had found a match. But who would she find to vet her work for accuracy? Who in the scientific community? So she joined APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization that was directed by Coral and Jim Lorenzen. She got in touch with Coral, and Coral contacted Stanton. And Coral said, if you're ever in Ohio, would you please meet with Marjorie Fish? And if you find that she's a credible person to talk to, then please find scientists who will vet her work. So that's what Stanton did eventually. He went to Marjorie's house. He told me that Marjorie he thought, more comfortable speaking with scientists than with speaking with the general public. Marjorie was a member of Mensa, meaning that she had a very high IQ, and he found her to be impressive, quiet and shy, but highly intelligent. And he was impressed by the work that she had done. So he contacted Dr. J. Allen Hynek. And Dr. Hynek at that time was at Northwestern University. And he was the head of the Dearborn Observatory at that time. And so Stanton and Marjorie went up and Marjorie had written a report for Dr. Hynek, and they met with him. They took a star map model, and he looked at all of the work, and he said that Marjorie's work was accurate. He also contacted Dr. David Saunders. Dr. Saunders was one of the lead investigators for the Condon Committee at the University of Colorado, scientific study on UFOs. He was a statistician. He discovered that it was very accurate as well. There was only one line that was a little bit off, and probably that was the line that Betty changed. And then eventually, Ohio State University, the astronomy department, examined it too. And at that time, they did finally have computers, and they discovered that, again, Marjorie's work was indeed reliable and accurate. And so this was big news. The next thing Stanton did is he wrote an article with a professional writer from California that he had worked with. And it was published in a magazine. And then Stanton contacted Terence Dickinson, who was an astronomer from Astronomy magazine. And he became interested in Marjorie's work and wrote a very scientific article that attracted a lot of attention from astronomers and also from disinformants and
well, one of them was Carl. Well, I don't know if I would call him a disinformant. I would suspect he was honest in his criticism. One of them was Carl Sagan.
Yes, Carl Sagan was one of them, but Carl, I'm not sure if it was Carl or someone else who presented the idea that you could throw marbles into a sand pit and find a match eventually, if you looked into the sky. But there were very important characteristics regarding the star map. And that was not brought up by any of the people who criticized it. And that was that all of the stars connected by lines on Betty's map were sun-like stars, although only 5% of the stars in our local galactic neighborhood out 54 light years are considered star-like stars. And all of those star-like stars in that volume of space were on Betty's map. The chances of that happening just by coincidence was 1,000 to 1. And it would have been higher if that one line had not been a little bit off in its angle. So that was incredibly important. And Terence Dickinson, in his analysis of Marjorie's work, stated that if we were on Zeta Reticuli, that's where it was identified as the two large stars with the 5 lines between them. If we were launching a space program and we wanted to go to the sun, to our solar system, that was the pattern that we would follow. We would go from star to star and look for planets where we could set up temporary bases and to go on to the next star system. And that all of these stars were in a plane, like pepperoni on pizza rather than raisins in a loaf of raisin bread. So it made sense with distance nearest star to nearest star. So that map was far more important than just identifying stars in the sky. Those stars had very special properties.
And just one thing that you didn't mention, I happen to know because I'm kind of into this star map, is that Zeta Reticuli is not observable from the northern hemisphere. You'd have to go down to Australia or South America or someplace like that in order to see it. So
yes, that is true, and it's very dim. I was told if you're in Australia looking at it or South America looking at it, it's in the constellation Reticulum, the net.
Mm-hmm. And just moving along. So Stanton Friedman gets interested in the star map. Not surprisingly, he's a scientist, so that's something that you can kind of sink your teeth into. But at what point did you begin your active collaboration?
We began our collaboration in 2005. We had, shortly after Betty's death, I'd written a manuscript. I'd been investigating that case for 14 years. And Betty had told me that if I needed any assistance with the book, that I should contact Stanton Friedman because he was honest and I could trust him implicitly. He was meticulous. And so I approached Stanton in 2005 and spoke to him about this and asked him if he'd be interested in joining me. We had already worked on a television show together after Betty's death and in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And he said, well, I want to see what you have first. I'm not going to agree to anything without seeing it. And so we arranged for him to come to my house. I was living with my husband in New Hampshire at that time, Stratham, New Hampshire, near the seacoast. And he drove down. He spent a few days with us. I had Betty's entire collection that I was preparing to establish an archival collection at the University of New Hampshire. So I had all of those archival files, and I let Stanton photocopy anything that he wanted. He read my manuscript, and we talked for hours on end. And at the end of this, he said to me, I will join you in writing this book because I can see that you're being unbiased and you're being scientific. And he said, I wouldn't work with you any other way. And so he did like my mind and the way I thought. He used to say that we thought alike, that we processed information in much the same way. And so we worked very well together. And we wrote Captured. He wrote the 2 chapters, one on the star map and one on disinformants and disbelievers. And he assisted me with a little bit more of the work that I was writing. I wanted him to write more as well, but he was very busy and he kept saying to me, you're doing fine, keep going. on other parts that he thought would be good to put into the book. So we finished this together. Dr. Bruce Maccabee vetted my work, and Linda Moulton Howe did, in addition to Stanton. And the book was published, and it became #1 bestseller in its category. So we were very pleased with that. We started working together, oftentimes speaking from the same stage, doing radio shows together. And then he contacted me one day and he said, how would you like to write another book together? And I said, sure. What do you want to write about? I love writing. When I went to college, I always wanted to become a writer. But my Aunt Betty said to me, do something practical. You let me make a living as a writer, be a social worker. So I was.
Well, you can do both.
Yes. So I did that. And yes. And so I have pretty much over the past 30 years moved toward becoming a full-time researcher, investigator, and writer. Stanton and I wrote 3 books together. The last one was Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. And it was about the archival research that we had done, because he had been to many archives even before we began working together. But we went to archival collections together and read the files there, and especially Donald Menzel's files, Philip Klass's files, Edward Condon's files. We retrieved a tremendous amount of information that we put into Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. I'm very proud of that book. It is all footnoted and a huge bibliography.
Kathleen, it sounds like you were doing a lot of Oppo research there. You were going after the archives of the debunkers and the critics. Was there any reason for that strategy?
Absolutely. They were the ones who were the disinformants, who were creating false information. And I first went without Stanton to the American Philosophical Society to read Philip Klass's archival collection specifically to see what he had written about Betty Hill. And I found a lot of information about him setting her up and disinforming the public about her work and what she was doing. And I felt that other people needed to know about this. So I ended up acquiring Philip Klass's FBI files, the files they had on him, and doing a very thorough investigation of who he was, what his background was, how he ended up becoming supposedly he was a UFO investigator, but he was a UFO disinformant who took every section of Betty's and Barney's case and rewrote it and filled it with speculation. So the things that he wrote are false. And he painted Betty and Barney with a new brush as well. He painted Betty as a lifelong science fiction fan and someone who was a UFO kook lifelong, and she was not. That was absolutely false. And he painted Barney as a guy who was so weak that he would do or say anything that Betty wanted him to. And that was absolutely false. You cannot take a black man who marries a white woman in 1960 and say that he is a wimp and a man who is a civil rights leader and a politician in the state of New Hampshire.
I don't think anybody doubts, Kathleen, that it was Klass's job, whether it was self-imposed or he was a CIA asset or fill in the blank, to actually sow the seeds of doubt in the public's mind. However, I wanted to bring up a few interesting things regarding the Betty and Barney Hill incident.
Okay.
And 1961, September 18th through September 20th, the USSR performed nuclear testing at Novaya Zemlya in the USSR in almost a straight line, 5,000 miles away from New Hampshire, where Betty and Barney Hill lived. I just thought that was interesting. But anyway, I wanted our listeners to listen to something that is fascinating regarding the situation that occurred, the horrific situation that occurred to Betty and Barney Hill. And something I wanted to let our listeners know also is there's a huge delineation between retelling a story and reliving it. Mm-hmm. And that is exactly what happened with Betty and Barney Hill when they went under into the hypnosis sessions that were held by their doctor that decided to take on their case on February 22nd, 1964. I wanted to read a little bit of the transcript regarding an excerpt of what Barney was saying to his doctor.
Okay.
And so Barney says, I was looking at them with binoculars. Doctor, oh, did they have faces like other people? You said one was like a red-headed Irishman. Barney, his eyes were slanted. Oh, his eyes were slanted, but not like a Chinese. Oh, I feel like a rabbit. I feel like a rabbit. Doctor, what do you mean by that? Barney, I was hunting for rabbits in Virginia, and this cute little bunny went into a bush that was not very big, and my cousin Marge was on the other side of the bush, and I was on the other with a hat, and the poor little bunny thought he was safe, and it tickled me because he was just hiding behind a little stalk, which meant security to him. When I pounced on him and threw my hat on him and captured the poor little bunny, who thought he was safe. Funny, I thought of that. Right out there on the field, I feel like a rabbit. Doctor, what was Betty doing all this time? Barney, I can't hear her. Doctor, did you make an outcry to her the way you did to me? You would remember if you did. Barney, I did not. I know this creature is telling me something. Doctor, telling you something? How? How is he getting to you? Barney, I can see it in his face. No, his lips are not moving. He's looking at me and he's just telling me, don't be afraid. I'm not a bunny. I'm going to be safe. He didn't tell me I was that bunny. Doctor, did you hear him tell you this? Barney, oh no, he didn't say it. Doctor, you felt he said it? Barney, I know. Doctor, you know he said it? Barney. Yes, just stay there, he said. It's pounding in my head. I gotta get away. I gotta get away from here. Now, end of excerpt. I think that it's critically important for folks to understand that people that have endured these kinds of experiences have to deal with an injury that you can't see, but it's in their mind and their brain and their spirit. And it's the feeling of being trapped and not having control of any kind. When we're born with the inherent right to be able to do what we feel is necessary and important for ourselves, for our own safety and happiness. And that was taken from them that night and a series of nights thereafter due to emotional trauma and more. And so when people like Phyllis Klaus come into the picture, it's really sort of their duty and their job as disinformants to make sure the public doesn't get even a whiff of this kind of terror that they went through. I wanted to bring something to your attention, by the way, Kathleen, and that is, and I wanted to ask if you agree with this, and that is it appears as though this phenomena regarding the UFO/ET phenomena and more are extremely multi-dimensional, so much so that traditional science is not really up to the task of facing the challenges of it. And in addition to that, that there's part of the phenomena that might yield to science only if they want it to. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And I think that's why we have used different terminology now, gone from flying discs, as they called them in the 1940s, to UFOs and unidentified flying objects, to now UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, because it is phenomena. And way back in 1952, Major General John Alexander held a press conference at the Pentagon. It was the largest press conference since the end of World War II. And he said in his opening remarks that these things have been seen in the air dating back to biblical times. They come back about once every century, they're reported, and then they go away. And he said that they came back in the 20th century and they're still here, and that the Air Force was studying this very carefully. They weren't getting upset. They were doing it very methodically. But he said the only thing that can explain this is phenomena.
Now, part of this phenomenon or phenomena, there's a whole other psychic or psychological dimension to it that not even psychology can come close to with regards to scrutinizing it, which is quite compelling. So on the one hand, humans have to grapple with the fact or the possibility that this multidimensional fill in the blank, whatever you want to call it, aside from phenomena, which has probably been happening for millions of years.
Yes.
The part of the issue is our minds can't seem to wrap itself around the phenomena in its entirety. And that's kind of a grandiose thing to say, but there's hundreds of thousands of abductees, contactees, witnesses, experiencers who have all complained, and rightfully so, that they have PTSD from their experiences. Some have been good experiences, but there have been plenty meaning people who have had tremendous issues in their lives that they can't seem to get over because they were exposed to it. And so you have had the privilege and honor of attending to people in a very caring way. And part of your job is being a professional listener. And one thing I'd like to let our listeners know that Kathleen has a very astute and acute skill set at is listening. And that's something that most people don't have. And that is the ability to actually listen very carefully to what people have to say. So I wanted to ask you, because people have been so highly traumatized by this phenomena, how have you been able to help people come to terms with this very multidimensional psychological dimension to this experience?
Well, I think that many, many people that I've worked with are traumatized because they think that they've been taken to craft and treated like lab rats. And they feel that this is abusive, intrusive, terrible things have happened, but they can't remember. And when I work with people, especially when I tell them, I'm not a licensed psychotherapist. I would like, before I work with you, to please see a licensed therapist who might use a technique using rapid eye movement so that you can talk about this, and you'll even remember part of this with a licensed psychotherapist. And people will go and they will do that, and they'll remember a little bit. When they have worked through the trauma, then they can come to me, and I will work with them in hypnosis so that they can remember more if that's what they wish to do. But what I'm finding is that people are not having these terrible memories of contact that we've read about. And I don't know how I can reconcile this because I'm not leading them in any way. In fact, I use forensic hypnosis, which doesn't lead at all. And it was the type of hypnosis used by law enforcement. And but when people talk with me, they might set up just a consultation with me to talk. There's something, I don't know what it is about me, but they lose their fear.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about something very briefly that happened to me that I've never talked about on any of our shows, and that is 20 years ago, I was in the realm of involved in the realm of technology career-wise, and I went to a Christmas party. And at that Christmas party, which was at night, it was during the day, but it turned dark rather quickly. And a friend of mine whom I worked with at that time, we went out into the veranda, like a porch-like area on a higher story of the building where that Christmas party was. And we looked out, and we both saw the same thing. And it was just this thing in the sky that was circular with a strange line going around on the inside of it and another line staying stationary. It looked just like a clock, and it was an X-ray color. And I didn't ask him leading questions. I just asked him if he saw anything in the sky, and he explained to me what it was, and he saw the same thing I did. And then we stared at it with our mouths open, and just thought that was very strange that the people on the ground were laughing at us, and then none of them were looking up at the sky. And they were couples that were laying on the ground in the grass. There was a long length of grass, and that comes into play later. Anyway, I told him I was going to leave. And the party didn't hold any value to me at that point. I wasn't drinking, neither was he. He was not a drinker. And I walked down to my vehicle in the dark. And by the time I got to my vehicle, I saw a grid that was starting to light up around me. And I hopped in my vehicle, and I thought, oh God, somebody put something in my drink. I would like to get home before then, if possible. If not, I'll pull off and figure it out from there. I felt completely sober as I was driving home. I didn't feel anything taking over my mind in the sense of, like feeling like I had drunk anything, like that would make me feel odd. The only thing I noticed was visually I saw this grid starting to light up brighter and brighter around me. And when I say grid, I mean a grid that bent around me, not just like straight up and down, but started to swirl around me. And I got home, and by the time I got home, it was lit up like a very bright UV light, like an X-ray light. And I didn't say anything to the individual who was at my house at the time, and the house was quite dark. And the individual that was there was actually good friends with a few of the people I worked with, and asked me how the party was. They said it was fine, and I stayed very quiet. And one thing I've always made sure was to not ask people leading questions, depending on if it's an interview, but if there's something going on, not to ask them leading questions. So I didn't say anything at all. And I just figured it was in my head. And we were very quiet. And he said, "What is that?" And I said, What is what? And he said, "It's a grid. That's a grid." And I said, "You see it too?" He said, "Yeah." And he said he saw little geometric forms swirling around. Some were octagonal, some were kind of like pyramid shaped and squared. And we all saw, he and I saw the same things. They were moving around like little fish swimming in an ocean. And he then just grew tired of it and went to bed. But that was it. That was how he responded to it. And he was done with it. I went to bed. And as soon as I closed my eyes, I was sent down a tunnel that was winding. And then I saw something that I'll never forget that I really don't want to describe, but I can tell you I was taken somewhere and I did see things. And what I wanted to kind of talk to you about is there's an element of the phenomena where people can be abducted through their minds. Because I didn't give my permission to go anywhere. Yet I was taken somewhere that night, and I saw that grid for 10 years.
Wow.
For 10 years, I saw that stupid grid. And there's a form of technology that it had. And it would take me a really long time to explain it, which I'm not going to, not on this show. But I couldn't do anything with it. Nothing meaningful to me in my life. That is, I'm not a scientist, so there was really nothing I could do with it. Now, did I do stuff with it? Yes, I did. But still, I got to the point where, you wake up in the morning, you see it. It might ease off a little bit during the day because, you're working and you see stuff. You see people walk by. Okay, stuff breaks right through it. It wears away. But at night, boom, it comes right back. And I finally had to beg it, please, just go away. I don't want to see you anymore. I don't know if it was a form of artificial intelligence that was just that, or artificial intelligence related to ETs, but it was something that had a ability to move on its own in its own fashion. So anyway, I know what it's like to be abducted in the sense of through the mind without giving permission. And I can tell my listeners and you this. There's something very, very strange about realizing that you don't have the right to be who you are and be autonomous, because people take that for granted, and rightfully so. But when it happens to you in that kind of psychological fashion and your rights are being taken away and you're being forced to look at things that you didn't give permission to look at, it's a very unnerving experience, and it's never gone away. And I think in part that's probably why I do these interviews. So I'm really glad I was able to share that with you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Did you see this only when you closed your eyes, or when your eyes were wide open too?
Whether my eyes were open or closed, I saw.
Is that so?
Yeah. And I noticed that if I was over water, I could actually see things in color, like other locations and places I had never been to, which was very strange. And so the grid was in an X-ray white color, but then after a while I started seeing, in the very beginning, pinpoints of millions of different colors. They were probably primary colors, but they were all mixed together, and then those pins of colors those dots became lines that would embed themselves and move with the other X-ray lines, and then suddenly all the X-ray lines just in tandem turned all different colors, and that would fluctuate. It would change randomly from X-ray colors to the vibrant, different purple, blue, red, green, yellow, all the different colors you can imagine. And I would see geometric forms, and some actually had a life of their own, like they actually had a consciousness, and they would communicate with me, and some had tasks to do, and they didn't seem very excitable. They were just used to doing their tasks.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no one to talk to about it. I talked to my friends, but they weren't scientists either. You know,
Yes.
I had friends that were blue collar and white collar workers and everything in between. And, you know, when you talk to people about this, I know you know this better than anybody, and so does Frank, but there's really nothing they can do for you. Now, I did talk to that friend of mine last year, and he allowed me to record him talking about how he saw that grid. And so really what I've come to the conclusion is I'm not sure what that thing was, but it followed me home, and it decided to stay with me for a while, or I attached to it somehow. Now, regarding the people on the grass, that friend of mine who witnessed that X-ray looking circle in the sky with the line that was moving through it and one staying stationary, we figured something out that was quite strange, and that was the cloned people. I say cloned because we realized later it was the same couple that was laying one way and then laying another, zigzagging through the grass on the ground. They were the same couple over and over again. We went back to that hotel, up in the same exact spot we had been in. We looked down, and the grass was a tiny little spot. It wasn't even capable of holding but maybe one couple, yet we saw a dozen or so. And that strip of grass had shrunk to a tiny little area, and it would have been an impossibility to have seen on the ground what we did. To this day, we still don't even know what it was that we saw there on the ground nor up in the sky. Now, I did ask him. I said to him, I know you saw something. What did you see? And he told me very reluctantly. He saw license plates that were backwards for about a week.
Wow.
And I've come to a conclusion and a theory regarding what it could have been. Now, the X-ray lights that I saw were the exact luminescent white of a license plate that glows in the dark. Mm-hmm. So my understanding about eyes, and I don't mind being wrong, perhaps a listener can correct me or not, is when people look at things, they see them reverse or upside down, and then the optics of the eye or the mind turns it back another way. Mm-hmm. So we end up seeing it the correct way up. Now, I think what happened is that luminescent light on the license plate tripped up his eyes, and it didn't allow his eyes to turn it the right way it should have been. Mm-hmm. And it just kept it backwards. And I said, I know you saw more than that. What else did you see? And he put his head down like he was a little boy in trouble, like he was going to the principal's office. And he was one of my best friends. I knew him very well, and he refused to talk about it.
Wow.
So I just thought that was kind of interesting, this phenomena when a person is exposed to it, and it can come in any way and many different shapes and forms. I know you've heard about many more than we have, Frank and I, because of your experiences of listening to people over many, many decades, thousands of people. It comes in so many different shapes and forms. It might even come in forms that we are not privy to in a conscious manner, but in an unconscious manner. So we might actually be dealing with witnessing this phenomena more than we realize en masse.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And, you are the first person that I have spoken with that has had the kind of experience that you had. I have spoken with several people who were in their 50s when they had their first experience, and whatever this was attached to their minds, so that every time they closed their eyes, they were someplace else. They were in a tunnel under the ground, and things were happening that were not very good. They were horrific, in fact. But I have never spoken with anyone who had the grid kind of experience that you had. A member of MUFON's experiencer research team, who I was their director for 10 years, and actually had set the team up. I've, due to time constraints, stepped down recently. But one of our members wanted to have an experience and kept asking for it. And he had something very strange that happened where he was in his bedroom at night with his wife. Both saw this, but it was as if the wall opened up and a bright light came through, and then they could see what appeared to be a room next to their room, but there wasn't room for a room to be there because the next house was only the width of an alley away. But it seemed like a large room, and these non-human entities came and stepped out of their environment and into his and her environment, and proceeded to do tests on him to remove fluids from his body. And very, very strange. So, it just seems that things are, there is definitely more than one thing occurring. And we're beginning to wonder if the typical UFO abduction events that we have become familiar with, such as having sperm and ova taken on craft, that sort of thing, is coming to an end. Members of our team have been talking about that. There are 45 members of the team, and most say that they really haven't received recent reports of people being treated in the manner that they used to be, such as the way Betty and Barney Hill were. So this is something interesting to look at. It appears that they're beginning a new program, and what is exactly is going on. Ray Hernandez, who started the Edgar Mitchell Free Foundation, and I was on the board of directors of that foundation, he called it a matrix kind of reality that he ended up in. I don't know if this is similar to what you had, but it didn't remain with him the way it did with you.
Yeah.
But he continued to have extraordinary experiences.
I think the only thing that I will mention about having gone down a tunnel when I closed my eyes, and I did want to mention when I went to bed and I closed my eyes that night, I kept trying to shake off the grid naturally because it wasn't natural to me, nor did I feel it practical or necessary to have it attached to me. So I kept trying to sort of tell it, and myself, okay, that's enough. I don't need to see this anymore. It's irrelevant and unnecessary to me. Also, I need to go to bed and I want to go to sleep. And I closed my eyes and I kept getting rushed. It was literally going down. I was going down very fast down a tunnel that winded around in a huge curve. And as I went down this very grid matrix like tunnel that I couldn't get away from. And by the way, I only saw this tunnel when I closed my eyes, but when I opened my eyes, I saw the grid around me. When I went down this tunnel, at the end of it, there was a geometric figure there that looked at me, even though it didn't have any eyes. And we were right in front of each other. I was sort of vertical to it, and there was a hole next to him. I say him just for the sake of saying that. But there was a hole next to him or it or her, whatever it was. And it nodded its triangular geometric head at me. And I went through the hole as if he gave me the approval to go in I didn't give myself approval. And as I went through the hole, I said to myself, if I can see that thing, what do I look like to it? Because I'm not physically walking there or running or being driven down or flown. I'm going through my mind. So what do I look like to it? And as I went through the hole, I saw something that I can't even, I will not tell the story here. I can tell you later, but it was absolutely unnatural and was out of this world. It was too much for me to handle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I'm glad I was able to talk to you about that. Thank you.
Yes, and we'll have to talk later.
Yeah, we'll have to talk later. But I did want to mention that, naturally, I think humans want to get to the bottom of anything that appears to be mysterious or compelling to them. However, there are times when people can become so traumatized or so overwhelmed, they don't want to get to the bottom of something. However, you have persevered all these years and you feel like you want to find out more about this topic. Do you feel it's true that you can't really get to the bottom of this kind of rabbit hole? Metaphorically speaking, meaning the phenomena. Will we ever find all the answers to it? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think we'll find the answers within my lifetime. I think that we have to develop a new scientific paradigm to even begin. And we're quite a distance away from that, I think. And the concern that I have is that these entities are so technologically advanced and so different from us that I would not want open contact with them. I think that it would be not a good thing for our society. I don't mind soft disclosure as long as the public can tolerate that without public hysteria. But I'm very concerned because whatever these entities are, they're very, very different. They look different, communicate differently. Their technology is so highly advanced that we can't understand it.
Yeah, well, before we end the interview, I wanted to remind our listeners of something I say often on the show, and that is it is the U.S. government's and first through third world governments on this planet's priority to absolutely find out what is traversing our skies or under our oceans or even on the ground. And anyone who thinks otherwise is absolutely naive. I wanted to let everybody know that if anybody wants to get any autographed copies of Kathleen's books, they're available on our website at Kathleen-Marden.com, and that's M as in mom, ARDEN.com. And I'm not going to let you go yet. I just wanted to mention your books. But there's the extraterrestrial contact, the alien abduction files, the new 60th anniversary edition of Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, fact, fiction, and flying saucers. And science was wrong, and flying saucers and science. You have consumed your life, Kathleen, to the betterment of humanity with really trying to jump in with all of your being into this topic. Do you feel you're a better person for it?
Yes, I do think I'm a better person for it because not only has it been a fascinating study, but I'm able to elucidate the topic as much as I can and a little bit, and to help other people who are having these experiences. It hasn't been service to self, it's been service to others during the entire time. And I was a teacher, and I continue to teach and to explore and to experiment and to attempt to find the answers. And oftentimes I speak with theoretical physicists who are involved in this kind of research as well, to gain a understanding using our own physical laws, but also theoretical physics. So yeah, it's been very rewarding intrinsically.
Before we go, I was going to ask you, What do you think is the end game? Before you answer that, I wanted to mention, I think part of the reason why we're having experiences with this kind of phenomena, whether it be multiple ET civilizations or one, or even just their artificial intelligence that might be floating around the planet, it might be an impossibility for us to not have experiences with them because we might be sharing the same planet with them. But what do you think the end game is for ETs who are intermingling with humans or abducting them or studying them? What is the point?
I don't know what the end game is. I've worked on 3 major studies with experiencers, with results from over 5,000 at this point, and we know what they have told us in open-ended questions. And these entities claim that they are concerned about our use of nuclear weapons. They are concerned about our environment and a possible environmental collapse. They explain that they are collecting flora and fauna from all over this world, that if we do end up destroying this planet, that they will at least have all of that DNA. They say that they're also seeding other planets, that they are terraforming. And, but who knows? I have a tremendous amount of feedback from experiencers around the world. Many are having contact with beings that they believe are benevolent. They believe that they have volunteered to come to this planet to work to save this planet. But there are others who are having horrific experiences, as I mentioned during our conversation as well. So, I've studied this pretty intensely for the past 30 years, but I still don't know the answer.
Frank, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple follow-up questions. They should be pretty quick. The first one is you mentioned going into the archives of others with Stanton, and since his passing, his archives have become available. Have you gotten a chance to go through that any?
No, I haven't. I'd have to go up to New Brunswick to do that, and it's going to take about 10 years to complete Stanton's archival collection. He has the largest in the world, archival collection.
I've seen photos of it, of the office.
Yes, the photos of the office will show you. It was incredible, but I don't have plans to go up there right away. I don't know if when I will go up. But I do have a lot of his files because we shared files. So he was able to photocopy mine. I was able to photocopy his. So I already have a lot of his files. So I'm happy about that.
And a relative of yours, a lady named Angela Hill. She is a mixed martial artist, and she is the granddaughter of Betty and Barney. Is that about right?
Yes, I'm not sure if she had been born before Barney died, but she was at least Barney's granddaughter, Barney's son's child. Okay,
that's a pretty tough way to make a buck, mixed martial arts.
I understand that she's very good.
Yep. Okay, so this was fantastic. I mean, we covered some pretty dense material there, and I think we did it in kind of a logical progression. So, Kathleen, sure do appreciate you coming on with us. So this was great.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it, and thanks for having me.
And Chant, anything else?
Yeah, I just want to remind our listeners to go to Kathleen-Marden.com. That's MARDEN.com. And don't forget to put the dash in between Kathleen and Marden. And You'll see all kinds of information on her, including her blog, upcoming UFO conferences, if any, and how much she's involved in experiencer advocacy, because she is probably the biggest advocate for experiencers that the UFO community has today, the most well-known one. And in addition to that, the multitude of books that she's written and co-written with the iconic Stanton Friedman, whom we all miss quite badly. And we want to thank you very much for your discretionary time, and we appreciate you so much, Kathleen, for all the hard work you've done on all of our behalf.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again, Kathleen. And that's it for this week. We might be back as early as next week. A lot of news came out over the last week, and could be some fallout from that. So we'll see. If not next week, then the week after or the week after that. But we'll be back soon enough with more. So thanks for joining us. Enjoy your weekend and have a great day. Bye-bye now.